Morning at Spencer Publications had always carried a certain rhythm, a structured calm that reflected the empire Bill Spencer had built through precision, dominance, and an almost obsessive control over every detail that passed through his hands. Employees arrived with quiet efficiency, conversations low and purposeful, the hum of activity forming a familiar backdrop that rarely shifted into chaos. But on this morning, that rhythm shattered before it could fully form, broken by a discovery so abrupt and violent that it transformed the building from a place of power into a scene of fear within seconds. The first employee who entered Bill's office did not immediately understand what she was seeing, her mind struggling to reconcile the image before her with the reality she expected, because Bill Spencer was not a man one imagined lying motionless on the floor, stripped of control, stripped of authority, reduced to something fragile and disturbingly human. The blood was what made it real, what forced the moment out of denial and into certainty, a dark, spreading stain against the polished floor that signaled not just injury, but violence. The alarm spread quickly, first through whispers, then through urgent calls, until the entire floor seemed to vibrate with panic that could not be contained. Someone called for help, someone else tried to approach, but hesitation held them back, as though stepping too close would make the situation irreversible in a way they were not prepared to face. When the paramedics arrived, they moved with practiced urgency, their presence imposing a structure on the chaos, but even their efficiency could not mask the severity of what had happened. Bill was unresponsive, his breathing shallow, his condition critical in a way that left little room for reassurance. And as he was carried out, the space he left behind seemed to absorb the shock, to hold it in place even as the building around it continued to move. The police arrived shortly after, their presence shifting the tone from emergency to investigation, from immediate crisis to something far more calculated. The office was sealed, every surface, every object suddenly transformed into potential evidence, into fragments of a story that had yet to be assembled. It did not take long for them to find the first piece that would shape the direction of their inquiry, something small, almost insignificant in isolation, yet loaded with implication and context. The hair clip lay near where Bill had fallen, its design unmistakable, the Forrester logo embedded within it in a way that made it impossible to ignore. It was not just an accessory. It was a symbol, one that tied the incident directly to a family already entangled in conflict with Bill in ways both personal and professional. The conclusion, at least in its initial form, came quickly, perhaps too quickly, driven by the immediacy of the evidence and the long-standing tensions that existed between the Forrestos and Bill. Ridge, Steffi, and Thomas were brought into the center of the investigation almost immediately, their names surfacing not through direct accusation, but through implication, through the narrative that began to form around the object found at the scene. Each of them had reason, history, motive that could be interpreted in a way that aligned with what had happened. The night before was dissected, every movement, every interaction scrutinized under the harsh light of suspicion, and while none of them faltered in their denial, the weight of the situation made it clear that denial alone would not be enough. Rich approached the questioning with controlled defiance, his frustration evident but contained, his focus on dismantling the assumptions that had been built against him. Steffi, sharper, more strategic, answered with precision, aware that every word would be analyzed, every hesitation interpreted as something more than it might be. Thomas, caught between defensiveness and something deeper, something less easily defined, struggled to maintain the same level of composure, his past casting a shadow over his present in ways that made it difficult for him to separate himself from the narrative forming around him. Together, they presented a united front, but beneath that unity lay the awareness that being suspected, even temporarily, carried consequences that could not be easily undone. While the investigation unfolded, the news reached Katie in a way that felt almost unreal, as though the words themselves resisted comprehension. Bill, unconscious, critically injured, found alone in his office. Each detail landed with increasing force, until the reality of it became impossible to ignore. Her reaction was immediate, instinctive, driven by something deeper than logic, something that propelled her toward the hospital without hesitation. The distance between hearing the news and arriving at his bedside felt distorted, time stretching and collapsing in ways that left her disoriented, her thoughts racing ahead of her, imagining outcomes she could not bear to confront. At the hospital, the sterile environment offered no comfort, only a stark contrast to the chaos that had led them there. Bill lay motionless, connected to machines that monitored the fragile line between life and something far more uncertain. Katie stood beside him, her composure breaking in a way she had not allowed herself in years, the strength she had cultivated dissolving under the weight of fear that felt both immediate and deeply personal. She reached for his hand, not expecting a response, but needing the connection, needing to anchor herself to something tangible in a moment that threatened to unravel her completely. The hours passed in a haze of waiting, of unanswered questions, of hope that felt increasingly fragile with each passing moment. And then, without warning, there was a shift, subtle but unmistakable. Bill stirred, his movements light, his eyes opening with a heaviness that reflected the depth of his condition. The room seemed to hold its breath, the machines continuing their steady rhythm as Katie leaned closer, her heart caught between anticipation and fear. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, strained and uneven, but carrying a clarity that cut through everything else. He did not speak of pain, did not ask where he was, did not seek reassurance. Instead, he said a name. A single name, spoken with effort, yet with certainty, a name that did not align with the narrative that had already begun to take shape outside that room. It was not Ridge. It was not Steffi. It was not Thomas. And in that moment, everything shifted. Katie felt the impact of that revelation immediately, not just because of what it meant for the investigation, but because of who the name belonged to. It was someone close, someone familiar, someone who existed within the boundaries of trust that had defined their lives. The idea that this person could be responsible did not just challenge the assumptions that had been made. It shattered them, replacing one form of uncertainty with another far more personal, far more difficult to confront. The information did not remain contained for long. As soon as Bill's statement was documented, as soon as the name entered the official record, it began to spread, moving through the channels of both law enforcement and media with a speed that ensured its impact would be immediate and far-reaching. The focus of the investigation shifted, the initial suspicion placed on the Forresters weakened, though not entirely erased, replaced by a new line of inquiry that introduced questions no one had yet been prepared to ask. Ridge, Steffi, and Thomas found themselves in a strange position, no longer the primary suspects, yet not entirely free from the shadow that had been cast over them. Their relief was tempered by the realization that someone else, someone within their extended circle, had now taken their place, and that the implications of that shift extended beyond the investigation itself. It suggested a level of deception, of hidden conflict, that went deeper than any of them had anticipated. Katie, meanwhile, found herself unable to move past the name she had heard, her thoughts returning to it again and again, searching for meaning, for context, for an explanation that could make sense of something that felt inherently senseless. The past began to resurface in fragments, memories she had not revisited in years now taking on a new significance, each one a potential clue, a piece of a puzzle that was only just beginning to take shape. There had been conflicts, of course. Bill's life had been defined by them, by decisions that had created both allies and enemies in equal measure. But this felt different. This was not the work of a distant rival or a calculated business adversary. This was personal, rooted in something that had not been resolved, something that had lingered beneath the surface long enough to fester into something far more dangerous. And then, as if drawn by the weight of her thoughts, a memory surfaced with a clarity that made it impossible to ignore. It was not a single moment, but a sequence, a recollection of a time when Bill had made a choice that had altered the course of someone else's life in a way that could not be undone. The details came back slowly, each one carrying a weight that felt heavier now than it had at the time, because now they were no longer just part of the past. They were part of the present, part of a chain of cause and effect that had led directly to the moment she now found herself in. The realization did not bring clarity. It brought something else, something darker, a recognition that whatever had happened in Bill's office was not random, not impulsive, but the result of something that had been building, something that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. And as Katie stood there, caught between the man she loved and the truth she was only beginning to understand, she realized that the story was far from over, that what had been revealed was only the beginning of something far more complex, far more dangerous than any of them had yet imagined. The name Bill had whispered did not simply linger in the air of that hospital room. It rooted itself in Katie's mind with a persistence that refused to fade, replaying again and again until it no longer felt like a fragment of a moment, but the center of an expanding storm. At first, she resisted it, instinctively searching for alternative meanings, for explanations that might soften its impact or reinterpret its implication into something less devastating, but the more she turned it over in her thoughts, the clearer it became that there was no mishearing, no distortion caused by injury or confusion. Bill had been certain, even in his weakened state, and that certainty carried a weight that Katie could not ignore. It forced her into a confrontation not just with the present, but with a past she had never fully examined, a past shaped by Bill's decisions, by the ripple effects of his actions, by wounds that had been inflicted and perhaps never healed. Outside the hospital room, the world had already begun to react. The shift in Bill's statement had redirected the investigation with immediate intensity, pulling attention away from the Forrestas and toward a new, far more ambiguous suspect. The police, who had been confident in their initial line of inquiry, now found themselves navigating uncertainty, their earlier conclusions unraveling under the pressure of new evidence that did not align with their assumptions. Ridge, Steffi, and Thomas, though no longer at the center of suspicion, remained tethered to the case by proximity, their involvement not erased but transformed into something more complex, more watchful, as though they had been pulled out of the fire only to find themselves standing at its edge. Ridge, in particular, found it difficult to let go of the unease that had settled over him, because even as the focus shifted away from him and his family, the existence of the hair clip remained unexplained. It was not enough to be cleared, not when a piece of evidence tied so directly to them had been found at the scene. That detail lingered in his thoughts, not as an accusation, but as a question, one that suggested the possibility of manipulation, of a deliberate attempt to mislead, to redirect suspicion in a way that had nearly succeeded. Steffi shared that concern, her mind already working through scenarios, possibilities that extended beyond a single act of violence into something more calculated, more strategic. If someone had planted that clip, then the attack on Bill had not only been personal, but staged, designed to implicate others, to fracture alliances, to create chaos within a family already under strain. Thomas, however, experienced the shift differently. For him, the removal of immediate suspicion did not bring relief so much as it deepened a different kind of anxiety, one rooted in the awareness that his past made him perpetually vulnerable to assumption, to being the easiest explanation for any act of aggression. Even in being cleared, he felt exposed, as though the incident had merely reinforced a perception he could not escape. That internal conflict, that struggle between who he had been and who he was trying to become, intensified in the absence of clear resolution, leaving him unsettled in ways that no official statement could fully address. Back in the hospital room, Katie remained by Bill's side, but her presence had shifted from passive vigil to something more active, more searching. She watched him closely, not just for signs of recovery, but for any indication that he might say more, that he might clarify, that he might provide context for the name that had already begun to reshape everything. When he drifted in and out of consciousness, she found herself leaning closer each time, hoping, almost fearing, that he would speak again. But when he did, his words were fragmented, incomplete, pieces of something larger that refused to fully form, leaving her with more questions than answers. The name led her backward, into memories she had not revisited in years, moments that had once seemed isolated but now began to align into something more coherent, more troubling. She remembered a confrontation, sharp and unresolved, one of many in Bill's history, but this one lingered differently, its emotional weight more pronounced now that she viewed it through the lens of what had happened. There had been anger, not the fleeting kind that dissipates with time, but something deeper, something that had carried a sense of finality, of damage that could not be undone. At the time, she had dismissed it as another of Bill's conflicts, another example of the way he moved through the world, creating as much destruction as he did success. But now, that memory returned with a clarity that suggested it had not ended as she had believed, that it had continued, evolving in ways she had not seen. The realization unsettled her, not just because of what it implied about the attacker, but because of what it revealed about Bill himself. The man lying in that hospital bed was not just a victim. He was also, in some ways, a catalyst, someone whose past actions had set in motion events that had now come full circle. That understanding did not diminish her concern for him, nor did it lessen the fear she felt at the possibility of losing him, but it complicated it, layering it with a sense of inevitability that she struggled to accept. As the investigation deepened, new details began to surface, each one adding complexity to a case that refused to settle into a clear narrative. Surveillance footage from the building revealed gaps, moments where cameras had been disabled or obstructed, suggesting a level of planning that went beyond impulsive violence. Entry logs showed no forced access, indicating that whoever had entered Bill's office had done so with a level of familiarity, either with the building or with Bill himself. These findings reinforced what Bill's statement had already implied. The attacker was not an outsider. This was someone who knew the environment, who understood the rhythms of Bill's life, who had chosen their moment with precision. The police, now working from this new framework, began to revisit previous cases, past conflicts, any instance in which Bill had been involved in a situation that could have escalated to this point. The list was not short, and each name that surfaced carried its own history, its own potential motive, but only one aligned with the name Bill had spoken. Only one fit both the emotional weight of Katie's memory and the emerging evidence. And yet, even as the pieces began to align, there remained something unresolved, something that did not fully fit. The presence of the hair clip, the anonymous call to the police, the timing of the attack, all of it suggested a level of orchestration that extended beyond a single act of revenge. It hinted at layers, at the possibility that the attacker had not acted alone, or that their actions had been influenced, guided, perhaps even manipulated by someone else. That possibility introduced a new dimension to the investigation, one that shifted the focus from identifying a single individual to understanding a broader network of intention. Katie felt that shift as well, though she could not yet define it in concrete terms. It manifested as a sense of unease, a feeling that the truth, even as it began to take shape, was incomplete, that something remained hidden beneath the surface. Her thoughts returned again and again to the name, to the memory, to the moment when everything had changed, and each time she felt the same tension, the same sense that she was standing on the edge of something she did not fully understand. When Bill finally stabilized enough to speak more clearly, the room felt smaller, the space between them charged with anticipation. Katie did not rush him, did not push for answers, but the questions were there, unspoken yet impossible to ignore. And when he looked at her, truly looked, there was something in his expression that mirrored her own uncertainty, a recognition that what he was about to say would not bring closure, but would instead deepen the complexity of everything they were facing. He spoke slowly, carefully, each word measured not because he lacked clarity, but because he understood the weight of what he was revealing. The attack, he explained, had not come without warning. There had been signs, subtle at first, then more direct, indications that something from his past had not been left behind as he had believed. He had ignored them, dismissed them as echoes of conflicts that no longer held power, but now, lying there, he understood that those echoes had been building, gathering force until they could no longer be contained. Katie listened, her fear shifting into something else, something more focused, more determined. The uncertainty that had defined her in the hours since the attack began to give way to a need for understanding, for clarity, for answers that would allow her to move forward, not just as someone reacting to events, but as someone actively seeking the truth. And as Bill continued, as the past unfolded in ways she had not anticipated, it became clear that the story they were now part of was far from over, that what had happened in that office was not an isolated incident, but the opening move in something far more intricate, far more dangerous than either of them had yet fully grasped. And somewhere beyond the hospital walls, beyond the reach of immediate investigation, the consequences of that truth were already beginning to take shape, moving quietly, deliberately, toward a confrontation that would demand more than understanding, more than justice, but a reckoning with everything that had led